Hi, everybody. Janet Sheriff with Mind in America. Today, we have a special guest, Silicon Valley author Ann Bridges, who's talking with us about her knowledge on the mining industry, where we've been, how we got here, and where we're going. Ann, welcome.
Thank you very much. Appreciate the opportunity to talk with you, Janet.
Well, I've really been looking forward to this conversation. And you and I have been chatting a lot back and forth, but to kind of find a topic about what to talk about. So I know our conversations ramble onto all kinds of different stuff, but maybe for the benefit of everyone listening, a little bit about yourself.
Sure. I'm actually a Chicago native that came out to the San Francisco Bay Area to go to college and stuck. It's a beautiful place and ended up just riding the wave of technology here in Silicon Valley, but in the marketing and the business end, the financial end. And was fortunate early in my career to be exposed to what became just kind of a cauldron of different business models, different purposes, different personalities involved. And when it got too much for me, I left corporate world, started my own business, and that got too much and kind of took some time off. And really wanted to share my experiences as actually one of the first women in business out here in Silicon Valley. At that level, we went through an IPO and all the other fun things associated with tying into Wall Street at that time. Um, but one of the things that struck me was how more and more Silicon Valley had become a bubble in terms of not paying attention to what had been the foundation of the technologies, which had been the Defense Department. We had a huge military presence in the 70s and 80s during the Cold War, and that ramped down. And instead, we leveraged the internet, which then leveraged software. And the whole concept of there being minerals and metals and hardware and manufacturing on which so much of our life is reliant at this point seemed to be missing from much of the discussion. The press wasn't talking about it. There seemed to be an obliviousness to the risks associated with having outsourced so much of our manufacturing to many countries, but primarily China. And then simultaneously, we had all these immigrants coming from China, from India, around the world, clearly. But you started seeing this shift in attitude and in I'll say kind of political bent. What was okay for the government to do or not? How is globalism good for this country or not? Where are the lines of these countries blurred? Is that good or is that bad? So libertarian very much took hold here. But when the Chinese embargo happened in 2010 for rare earths, I had already decided to start writing fiction about Silicon Valley, and I was appalled that literally no one was talking about it. No understanding that if we didn't have rare earths, that the computer industry was at risk, and that has a ripple effect in all of California. Our tax base is mostly with coming out of technology these days. And where California goes, clearly the country goes. And so there was just this void. So my second novel on business was called Rare Metal, and it was specifically about how the entire supply chain on a fictional basis was interrupted for the technology industry. So that was my purpose in writing my novels, really was just kind of to wake people up, but it launched me all of a sudden into the kind of being the face for Silicon Valley on a lot of these issues in the minerals industry. And I hooked up with Dr. Ned Mamula, and he approached me to write a nonfiction book, but that was simple enough for a lay person to understand, specifically a lot of Congress people, non-academic, but not fiction either. So we collaborated and came out with groundbreaking. And I found so over the last 5, 6 years have been talking about these issues ever since, which sadly haven't changed much. That we still have a over reliance on China mainly for our imports and processing of the minerals and the metals we need in order to be a successful country.
I have read Groundbreaking, and I think everybody should read that book. And there's so many things that we can talk about with your work that led you to this. I'm going to summarize it by please first tell everyone where we can find your books.
Groundbreaking is available wherever you would normally get a book. Amazon, you can order it through Barnes and Noble. It's it's soft cover and ebook. And yes, it is still relevant today. It came out in 2018, but I've been amazed as I've looked at it and talked to Ned. Sadly, except for the specifics on, which mineral proportionality, the grounding that we tried to do which was to explain to the non-chemists and non-geologists why minerals are important, what we're really up against, and how it feeds into so many of the issues today. Like green energy requires more and more minerals. You've probably heard of lithium, but you have no idea what that means. If you want to electrify your grid, you need more copper. So there are just some fundamental truths that we tried to tie together in a way that would make it obvious that this was an issue that needed addressing.
And I've also spoken with Ned, and we're going to have a conversation on the podcast in the future with him. I went down a rabbit hole. I decided when I started this podcast that people need to be educated on the mining industry, and that I'm not going to change the world, but if I could just bring some awareness and education, maybe that leads to some change in a positive way. So I started going into the US Geological Survey's annual mineral reports. And I ended up pulling 6 decades of reports. I went back to the 50s. And because every time I went to another report, I'd start to get more upset. And more disturbed by the amount of wealth that we as a country have transferred to other countries. And, mining production values, the numbers are staggering, how much they've reduced since the 50s and 60s. And the Cold War was another time, the ending of the Cold War was another transformation in the industry. Then I read Groundbreaking. And I realized I could have saved myself months of research in the USP because you summarized it. And what little fact, as an example, 22 critical minerals that we need for defense medicine, our own society, are 100% sourced through other countries. Just as an example, correct?
Right. At least.
And it was staggering because this goes into defense. It goes silver, 88% of silver is sourced from another country. We use it in medicine. We use it in hospitals. Anyway, I could go on. I found the book something everyone should read, and I'm not a geologist. Full disclosure, married to one. I have some theories on how we got here, but I'd like to hear a little bit about you. Like, how did we get here, and then we're going to talk about how we go forward.
I don't even know how to say how we got here in broad terms. I think that, when China, you need to understand China, and a lot of people, frankly, in this country don't. And I have learned it's for a valid reason. So let me just paint it for people who aren't into history, because that's kind of my second passion, which is in early 1900s, China basically closed down. They kicked out the British and they closed their borders, and they kind of had their own revolutions. They had problems. We were their ally in World War II, but they basically became a communist country and very isolated, which actually over their centuries of civilizations is not atypical for them. But they had famine, they had problems. And when Mao, this is all under Mao, millions of people starved to death, millions of people died. So when they came out of that in the early 70s, they were this huge country that really needed help. And I think at that point, the US had become the power of the world. We'd won world wars. And I think there was a real effort to say, we can help this country. We can help them grow the same way we had helped Japan, for example, recover for World War II. And so it seemed very simple to say, well, let's just give some of these simple manufacturing jobs to them. After all, they have these minerals and they can do it easily and cheaply, and it will be beneficial for everyone. And I think that Whether there was an intent for it to get as bad as it did, I don't know. But clearly, at the point at which the labor cost was less, and China strategically, somewhere along the line there, had figured out that just like the Middle East had oil, and in the 70s, we were reliant on OPEC, and the oil output became a very strong negotiating posture politically. China figured out that they had rare earths, which were very, very key to all the emerging technology. I mean, computers were coming along in the 60s. We, sent rockets to the moon. So it wasn't that we didn't know that we needed lighter steel or aluminum, et cetera. But they very strategically figured out that if they could just simply say, well, we'll just do it all for you. Just bring your manufacturing here. It'll be easier, it'll be cheaper. You don't have to have the know-how. And we just became dependent on them completely, to the point where it's so integrated that our defense manufacturers, for example, Lockheed and Boeing, they sell to China as well as source from China. So saying, well, you have to stop sourcing from China, they would lose a huge revenue stream. Same thing with Tesla, same thing with Apple. They're selling into this huge consumer market, and they want to expand into that consumer market. And the Chinese customers want to buy American goods. And so the heads of these large corporations, when you ask them questions, why are you doing this? They go, well, you got to understand, we are intertwined at this point. So the question is, do you break those links completely, or do you at least come up with a secondary redundant supply chain of our own, or at least with some of our closer allies, so that we are not 100% dependent on China? Because they have proven, as I've said many times, during their civilization, that it just takes one leader who decides that they want to go back into themselves, and they do. They are a very strong culture, very strong society internally, and so it's not outside of the realm of existence for them to do something like that. Americans have a hard time conceiving of that, because we weren't taught anything about China. Very few people even had textbooks to read until maybe the 70s. So our generation that grew up 50s, 60s, early 70s, it wasn't part of our curriculum. We just weren't aware of it unless we were reading all the newspapers every day.
Yeah, yeah. I had a bit of an awareness when I was young. My uncle was the press secretary to the Prime Minister of Canada, Pierre Elliott Trudeau. And I remember my uncle in the early 70s going to China often. And it was a completely foreign experience. But he would come back and he would spend weeks over there. And it was what you're talking about, like, helping China get to that new place.
Mm-hmm.
I have a question for you in all of this. And economics degree, it's my background. I'm not an economist. I'm not that bright. Did my final year paper on Japan as an isolated society, economic and successful economic society. So I'm aware of what you're talking about. How much do you think where we ended up here was due to the US dollar as the global currency? So the US trades in treasury bills and has a financial product that it puts out, and then in return manufacturing, mining is what's traded.
I'm not an economist. I will simply say clearly the US dollar is, hopefully still is, but certainly was the dominant currency. And for many decades, China, gladly bought up, for example, US debt. Now, from their point of view, they might have said, well, this is a good way for us to now be a creditor to the US, and have that as a geopolitical bargaining chip. Whether that was purposeful, whether that was simply a way to shore up their own banking industry with the yuan, I do not know. I think the other element in all this is that commodities are not very well understood. As I indicated, learned Wall Street and the stock market pretty well. And I think out here in Silicon Valley, especially, people understand the stock market. The firms are represented here, et cetera. Venture capital is big here. But when you start talking about commodities, it's like a whole new business model, the concept of, for example, pulling something out of the ground and putting it in the warehouse until the prices come up, that just doesn't make sense. I've talked to investors who say, well, I will invest only in this one portion of the mineral supply chain and I won't do the rest. And that, as an investment choice, that doesn't make sense to a lot of people, because here it's like, well, why wouldn't you do as much as you could? And it's because the commodities just handle contracts differently and have the ability to affect time, and marketplace. You have to understand Silicon Valley has become a point where you have product life cycles that are 6 months. So you're literally talking about a communications gap when you're looking at an industry that takes 20 to 30 years just to get started. By that time, these guys are dead or retired or whatever. So you have real mindset clashes between the people who are anxious to get something done and getting impatient with the fact that they may have to wait decades. They just shrug and say, yeah, never mind, I'll just do whatever I need. So when I've talked to supply chain guys, who have the software that are trying to track down the sourcing for different items, they admit that it gets to a certain point and then they just shrug because it's too complicated and they can't get valid information out of China, for example. There's nothing accurate, there's nothing reliable necessarily. So they just go to a vendor that has today's prices on it and that's what they buy. It's very much just in time, just in minute time, as opposed to, long-term contract time.
Interesting. So speed of fulfillment is a huge issue. I have not considered that at all. Really, really important. News to me.
One more thing that's interesting. You're talking about some of the other side of mining is the recycling portion of it as well, that people think, well, I'll just figure out a way to collect all these old PCs and we can fill the need that way. But the same reason that the manufacturers here, the PC manufacturers, for example, want to make sure that they have a reliable source and they're okay with buying it from China, India, whomever. For recycling, they say, well, you tell me when you have 5 years worth of guaranteed product that you can get to me, and I will possibly look at starting to use your stuff, your recycled output. Well, for a recycler who's trying to do something new, even with a new technology that sounds sexy and wonderful and earth friendly, 5 years, I mean, they're running around trying to do something they can get a prototype for 30 days, and there is no guarantee that they could get recycled products for 5 years in order to fulfill the need that a large manufacturing company has to rely on in order to plan their business. So it's an issue again of scale. You have the small guys running around trying to do as much as they can, and you have these big manufacturers wanting to make sure that they have a secure supply of whatever it is. And the only country now that really has been able to step forward and guarantee that has been China, partly because of their resources and at this point their know-how and their commitment to the metal and metallurgy industry.
There was a book, I think it was in the 70s, maybe the 60s, that started the whole, we're going to recycle everything in the metals industry. That was, do you remember the name of it?
No, I don't. No.
Yeah, it was like the beginning of the whole unsuccessful move to recycle everything. And
well, I've heard that aluminum, everyone knows aluminum and they point to that. Oh, there's a metal. Aluminum is the single most recyclable item. Like you can get 80% use of it. Everything else falls away from that. Right now, the cost of gathering recycling is more than the output required. So now we just have landfills filling up with pretty much everything because it's just not cost effective.
And in China, is there a cheaper cost of energy that allows this to be more successful for them?
Well, now they're building coal plants, so sure.
Yeah. Yeah. Powerhouse. How much, here's a question for you. How much has COVID and the supply chain issues and the Ukraine-Russia war brought awareness to the need to have domestic supplies?
Absolutely huge. I mean, so groundbreaking came out in 2018, and no one was talking about supply chain. COVID hit, and all of a sudden in February 2020, um, people were, running out of toilet paper, and the whole concept that you had to worry about something in advance. So then everyone stocked up, and then we were, short of shelves because everyone had their own at home. So I think for the first time, the average consumer understood that things didn't just happen magically, and it wasn't necessarily big bad corporations' fault. It could be that another country locked down. Right at that point, the whole concept that a country would just simply stop shipping. The libertarians here in Silicon Valley just literally had a hard time getting their brain wrapped around that, because they always looked at it and said, well, for the right price, anyone will do, well, you can get anything. Well, that wasn't true during COVID, right? And during a war, as much as you may want to, there may be restrictions. A bridge may be blown up, whatever the case may be. You cannot transcend, like you can on the internet and virtual. You cannot transcend the physical realities of logistics. And that discussion, and young entrepreneurs are really jumping in with both feet trying to solve this problem, because they see an opportunity, which I think is great. But it still hasn't really affected the sourcing of so much of our product, which is still the minerals and the metals and the know-how to turn those minerals into metals into product.
Now, I ended up in a roundabout way in the mining industry. It wasn't a career I knew anything about. It wasn't a career I came to through my education. I came in through a very unusual path. But I think it's the most fabulous industry in the world. It's the source of all the creation of wealth. You go back to Roman times. You don't build a strong economy without mining what you need to operate as a society. So a lot of that's why we have these discussions. So how do we go forward? How do we educate and start building an industry that has serious timeline issues? Permitting in the US is for a conventional mine is 7 to 10 years. And that's after you spend a significant amount of capital defining a resource, for example. So then you go into construction. How do we advance this to our benefit?
Well, I think we need to attack this simultaneously on a number of fronts. One is attitudinally, and I just point this out because it was mind blowing to me. The Chinese have we have four elements when we look at life. It's fire, air, water, and earth. They look at it with five, and the fifth is metal. Basically, they look at earth as it supplies plant life, but and so when you take your vitamins and minerals, right, we all know that we take calcium, we take zinc, we look at these things, they're part of our discussions. But they also see that one of the values of life, one of the foundations of civilization, is metal, that you can take out of that same earth and now create a human-based tool. So part of that is just mindset. If we can just think like they do in that emphasis, I think that will help people a lot see that we're not trying to ruin air. We're not trying to ruin, rape Mother Earth, which is the words that the environmentalists use. We are trying to utilize the components of Earth beyond just plant life to the metals and minerals that really sustain human life at this point. And more than just human life, we can't protect the salmon and the birds if we're not also protecting them with the machinery that we are using these days, the medical devices to monitor. I mean, there's everything that we use. So that's one. The second simultaneous we need to do is to encourage more education, more universities to start offering not only geology but metallurgy. I've talked about that a lot. The phrase really means converting the stockpiles of minerals that the DoD, the Pentagon, is so proud of saying they have, to the metals, the advanced metals that we need today. This is not something simple. This is advanced chemistry. This is understanding where you can source them. This is understanding, again, where you can have a supply that you can count on pulling from, and all the applications. So mining, minerals, mining, metals, metallurgy, all to create the products that we need. So there needs to be an emphasis on that. And for example, out here at Stanford, they just endowed, one of the venture capitalists endowed a huge amount of money. I think like $1 billion to Stanford for a sustainability department, which is great. They rolled geology under that, which is okay. The question I have is whether or not they are going to really pay attention to the geological part, or whether this is really just going to be another environmental activist, protect the environment as opposed to utilize it. So those are the kinds of issues. And then obviously, if you can do anything from a regulatory, governmental standpoint to really slash and burn all the things that are getting in the way. And time is money. I mean, from an investment point of view, if I have $10 to invest and I can get $1 back in a week, or I can get $1 back in 10 years, any logical person will say, I'll take $1 back in a week and I'll have $11. Well, that's exactly what investors are saying. There's no reason to wait 20 years. And that's why you have these global conglomerates who really are dominating the mining industry, because they're really the only ones with the resources and the know-how to be able to weather this kind of multi-decade permitting process.
I'm going to add another option to get us going, but I want to talk first about the metallurgy issue, because I ran a gold company and I had visible gold at surface and near surface. And the typical model is drill and finance, drill and finance. And I didn't like that model. I actually came into the sector thinking that didn't make a lot of sense. When I can see the gold, if I can't get it out of the ground, drilling to prove up a resource is irrelevant. So we went a whole different route where we established the metallurgy. And then we determined how to get the gold out of the rocks before we got into an aggressive drill program, which was completely counterintuitive. I wasn't too popular at times, but I'm happy with me. But that leads me to the fourth thing I think we need. I think we need new technology in the sector, and there has not been an appetite for it from my experience. But we need to see funding sources, and we need to see the industry, the big companies, looking at new technology. I don't know how you feel about that.
I agree. I mean, when we're talking about it, like I said, advanced chemistry, for example, I think the biotech industry sucked up a lot of chemists over the last few decades with the discovery of DNA and then gene splicing, et cetera. And so the pharmaceutical industry has been the hot place to go for anyone who's into chemistry. I have been paying attention to some of the advancements utilizing technology in the mining sector. And I've been amazed at some of the advances that have been made, not just in mining itself being cleaner and safer and more efficient. And they're some of the earliest users of some of the, like green technology, the batteries, the solar, everything, because they're in such remote locations, and yet they're running businesses just, with hundreds of people on site. So part of it is the mining industry being proud of itself and being able to try to attract technologists and chemists into their need, into solving the problem that we all want solved. And it may just be a matter of telling the right story, or getting the current generation to understand how important it is. One guy I talked to years ago, I said, I was asking similar questions. How do we wake the average consumer up? And he said his favorite story was a guy would go into Parents' Day at a school, grade school, junior high school, and he'd have a big hefty bag with him, and he'd say, okay, we're going to put in this bag everything that is mined, right? Well, once he had the kids almost stripped down to their underwear, right? Because between
Yeah.
between everything they owned, which included smartphones and pencils and pens. And he pointed out that, of course, their clothes were manufactured using machines, which means really it included that. What that got their attention. They went, "Oh, okay, we can't just shrug and say it's not important. We do need to at least recognize that that is a part of our life that we are relying on, and we want to continue to rely on." So those kinds of shock stories, I think, need to be out there. And I think the industry, the mining industry magazines probably need to do better outreach to the rest of the media so that the information that's coming out is not just regurgitated stories all the time with old pictures that show, slash and burn sites that are from 50 years ago, 70 years ago, that would never be used today. But that's what those are the pictures that are in the standard photojournalist shop, and so that's what they use.
So don't preach to the converted, reach out to the people yeah,
Yeah.
I get it. What's the saying? If it's not mine,
If it's not grown, it's mined.
there you go. That's the
Yeah.
saying I'm looking for. And I need to give some credit where credit's due. There is new technology coming. I don't think it's being shared broadly. And I think, I don't know if you agree with me, sometimes the mining industry, in order for self-preservation, has taken a bit of a duck and cover model. Just don't want any attention drawn to itself because it's so difficult with the regulatory regime. And I think we need to start really promoting the advances that we've made. And the one that I'm thinking of that I think is a real example of a great game changer is small modular reactors. If you can create a small modular reactor that can power a remote lead zinc operation somewhere in North America, your capital and operating costs go down, and the value to the consumer is higher. It's not as expensive. So I don't know how you feel about that, but I see those types of examples very quietly moving forward.
Well, that's interesting because in some respects, so the defense industry is the ultimate buyer of the really advanced technology. But what you're describing is a different business model. It's saying, let's apply the most advanced energy systems to make the extractive industry not only more cost effective but safer and broader, and what everything else that goes on with SMRs, different locales. The ultimate benefit is not just the DoD then, but it also becomes an industry then that can use some of this advanced technology without having to go through the DoD, because the procurement processing for anything that's defense related is even crazier than standard, and yet they've become the de facto purchaser of a lot of the mineral output simply because they're there and they need it and they want it, and so everyone ends up running to the Defense Department as opposed to what you've got out here in Silicon Valley, where it was all private, all open, all shared, and everyone just learned from each other on the fly very, very quickly, which is why the technology industry took off in the last 30 years so well.
Yeah, and jumping around a little bit, let's bring some refinery and smelting back. It always amazed me that the option was to send rocks over, have them processed, and then send back the product. There must be some economies of scale in reestablishing them in North America.
I would hope so. And I think what's sad, no one wants to say that, MP Materials, for example, in Southern California, reluctantly acknowledges that much of their output still goes to China. They're building a new refinery, I believe, and processing for rare earths in Texas. But it's not for all rare earths. There are 17 of them, and it only works for some of them. And you've got to you've got to learn to understand how to kind of parse the language, which is sad in some respects, because they should be able to say it and have be proud of what they're doing. We're only doing 2 to the 17, but that's not sexy enough. That's not what the investors want to hear. That's not what the media will pick up. And so you kind of sell what you can, and hope that you don't get nailed by the SEC or whomever who's watching every word you say when you're a public company.
Well, I don't think we're going to change the world in this one conversation, but I do think that you have very eloquently helped with some awareness and education on the issues, and for that I thank you a great deal, Anne.
Well, thank you very much for that compliment. I have to give Ned a lot of credit. He's, that research that you did that you could have saved yourself on, he did the heavy lifting. He's got an entire career I think he's an economic geologist, which means he understands that wealth creation. And I really just toned down some of his stuff, recognizing the consumer consumer element trying to read this. But to me, it was a huge learning experience. I mean, that thing with the 5 elements versus 4 elements just happened. I was hiking with a friend of mine on a trail, and we were just talking about the elements, and she said 5. I said, no, there are 4. She's Chinese. And we literally just stopped dead on the trail, and we're comparing notes. And I went, I had no idea.
I had no
So
idea.
sometimes it's those kinds of chance encounters that really wake you up to we do have different perceptions as a culture on what we're going to respect and do and how to do that.
I worked predominantly in the Indigenous community, doing community-based economic development work before I went into mining at their request. And I was taught that Creator gives you what you need. It provides Mother Earth and all the bounty and wealth that she can provide. You just responsibly manage it. And I have taken that to apply to how you manage the hunt, when you are feeding your community, to how you extract metals. It's the gifts are all given to us.
They are. And I think if we don't look at it responsibly in advance, it's very easy to just ignore what's happening. I mean, you have deep sea mining now being the next sexy thing, or asteroid mining. Oh, if we can't get the permissions on land, let's go into international waters. Let's go into outer space. That's crazy, right?
Yeah, what could possibly go wrong?
That's really what's motivating it.
Yeah.
Right. But then I have some geologist friends, and we were talking about the volcano that exploded in Tonga Tonga a couple of years ago. And they said, well, we don't ever do anything underwater. And I'm like, well, we've got these huge resources of these underwater volcanoes. What geologists are studying them? I mean, gosh, this is how islands are formed. This is major stuff if we can figure out how to tap it. And they're like, oh no, we don't do that. So now you have the people who study water, right, don't understand earth geology, and the people who understand earth don't understand how to get it in the water. So you've got a whole new kind of learning curve in order to solve the same issue, which is how can we responsibly tap the minerals we need in order to sustain life across the board.
Fascinating, Anne. We could keep going, but I would like you to tell people how to find you on social media and on the internet.
Sure. Probably the easiest way is just to do a search, Silicon Valley author Ann Bridges. I'm the only one. I'm on Twitter. I have my own website, and I have a number of fictional books and some nonfiction, all on Amazon. That's probably the easiest way to do it. That's how people find me.
Well, thank you so much for joining us today. I look forward to continued conversations. My head's kind of hurting right now dealing with all of the facts you're throwing out here, but thank you for joining us, and thank you everyone for joining us. Mining is, in my opinion, the greatest industry a country could hope for. So thank you, Anne.
You're welcome. Thank you. And I will say it's also one of the original industries. Otherwise, we'd be back in the Stone Age.
Exactly. Thank you. Everyone, have a great day, and we'll see you next time.